I was exposed to science really early on. As a little kid, I grew up with a father who happened to be a scientist. That led me to be exposed and have a lot of interaction with different people in different positions of the scientific world and the lab.
I became interested in science at a very young age. I was one of those kids that always asked their parents, why this, and can you explain that? And that just never changed. Even as an adult, I'm very inquisitive. I always ask questions.
So my interest in science is actually more of, originally it was a medical interest. My whole life I've always wanted to help people, help things, help animals. And like any other kid, I wanted to be a surgeon, then I wanted to be a veterinarian. But the whole time I was curious in what science was, why things were the way they were.
When I was younger, my family got the opportunity to take a vacation down to Florida, and we went to Cape Canaveral. That was sort of the big highlight event. My father, who's a science teacher, was really interested in going to Cape Canaveral because there was a shuttle launch that was scheduled. It was really at that point, even though I was so young, I knew I wanted to be in science.
So growing up, I think I always knew I wanted to do something health-related. I just always loved going to my pediatrician. She was really good friends with my mom. It did help that she also looked like me, so it was kind of like I got to see myself in a future position growing up.
Growing up, I was in a small town. Didn't really have any like pathways in our high school, so always knew science was kind of what I wanted to do. When I was younger, I got really interested in marine biology based off of a book, and I spent hours going through it. It was about whales and dolphins, and I was like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do.
So my greatest hope with the gene editing technique and just growth is that we can really take advantage of the technology and take its potential and drive it in the right form where we can actually accomplish maybe personalized medicine and move clinical treatments to a better place than where we are right now. And I think that's something that we're seeing. The worries are that people get too ahead of themselves, that we don't take enough time to learn about this breakthrough technology, that we get ahead of ourselves. And I know all of us are really excited of working with this and seeing all the potential it has, but we've seen that there are barriers that we still need to overcome, and we need to engage more as a scientific community to acknowledge that and get ahead of ourselves. So, like Kevin, I know that you've been trying to help get around those barriers with like decoder and to better understand the limitations that we have in understanding the sequencing. And Sambi, right, you deal with sequencing all the time, and sometimes we think we got something out of our cell lines, but if it's not because of the interaction that you guys can have with your program and your level of understanding of the sequences, we could say, oh, we achieved a knockout and we achieved curing lung cancer, but we have to take a step back and really understand what was that edit from the gene editing. So do you guys have any comments on what your takes are on that? Do you see like that being a very big barrier? Are we close to overcoming those barriers when it comes to promising things with the technology that we're not ready to overcome?
When it comes to the actual science of it itself, there's a lot of talk that sort of goes around with how the findings themselves are relatively easy to communicate within the field. When we go and we give talks and professional presentations and the like, it's pretty easy to communicate that information. But when we're trying to convey it to the lay public, the general understanding of science as a whole, and specifically biological science, is very different depending on the types of people that you talk to. So if you're trying to communicate just generally to the public, especially if you're going for like press releases on things with Decoder, for instance, when we were doing the press releases for those, it was a lot of, there's only so far that you can simplify the explanation before you start losing information.
Yeah, I think education is a really big component in gene editing, not only from the level of science and going from the education between scientists of maybe people from chemistry or people from physics understanding the advantages and limitations of the technology, but also education at different levels, like a level in the high schools of kids understanding potential new careers that weren't available 20 or 15 years ago when their teachers were were still in college, and even education at the clinical level, because I know, Indigo, you're in med school, and this is something that maybe by the time you're graduating, right, hopefully this technology is ready to go into patients as it is in clinical trials. How do you think you would approach the conversation with a patient, right, that maybe has overheard a little bit about CRISPR, saying, well, I don't want that treatment because I've heard about like off-target effects, and I don't want my liver cells being affected because you targeted my eye, like with the treatment that is currently out there for eye disease. How would you approach that? And especially in your case that you've had the chance to use the technology and learn a lot about it from the insider point of view.
I would really stress the specificity of the treatment and the fact that knowing the work that goes into the research and making sure, in the example you gave, that a therapy that is targeted for your liver is specifically targeted for your liver and is not going to travel to your eyes, of course. But like you all were saying, I think education is extremely important. Yes, there's instances where it's oversimplified, but if you can just get the overall point across, sometimes that simplification helps. And people who might not have understanding of what this protein is or what this gene is and how does that, affect my overall biology, my overall physiology. My hope would be one day that we get to a point where we're delivering these gene therapy technologies in the clinical setting, and that one day there's a way to explain it to patients where it doesn't seem like it's some form of mad science, that they think that people might think, oh, you're changing my DNA, you're changing this, that's not supposed to happen, or that's not good. Because sometimes people think that when you say gene therapy, they're like, oh, that's not normal, that's not okay, and they just get all these ideas of sci-fi movies they might have watched and saw on TV, and you just have to bring that back down, bring it back to reality, and get them to understand all of the research that goes into creating these therapies and creating specificity within these therapies, so that it's not. We really take time to think about the delivery and making sure that it is going where it's supposed to be. It's going to the target. And I just hope one day we get to a point where we're able to use these therapies clinically and then explain them to anyone what exactly they are and what they're doing, and have that understanding. I went through a stage when I was younger where there was a lot of death in my family. Most of the time it was from diabetes type 2. And so I would ask my parents, why is this aunt or this uncle having this complication? I really didn't understand it. And science is what helped make sense. What helped make all of these things that were happening around me make sense.
My grandfather was a physicist and a chemical engineer for the military, so he was able to kind of give me a little bit of that side of the science, but I never truly got the biology until I got to high school. And once I got into high school, I got to do all the cool DNA extractions from strawberries and things that just seemed so unique and so interesting.
I think my interest didn't grow as fond until I was closer to my high school years, where I had a better understanding of it. And my senior year, I took a class in genetics, and that really was what prompted me to do a deeper dive into different pathways that I could pursue for my undergrad career.
So it always started with wanting to do something health-related. Getting more into a science background was really my mom. She was a special educations teacher, So if I ever wanted to do any extracurricular after school that was like dance or art or something fun, she made me also pick up something educational. That would be math club, science olympiad, chess club. So all of that was more of my mother's doing. But it did end up working in my favor. I did end up growing a love for science, which carried on into high school.
I was always very interested in science as a whole, but focusing more on the engineering standpoint. When I got up to high school, for instance, I was very interested in computer science. I had a science teacher in my junior year who was so passionate about what he did and who was so interested in the work that he was doing. The research itself was interesting. From a physical level, it was a lot of taking liquids from one tube, putting it into another tube, and then taking microscopic samples of things and moving them around. But from a conceptual level, what you could do with that was so amazing, and the way that it was taught was so incredible that it was something that I definitely wanted to be a part of.
We all have very unique backgrounds, and we've discussed that at different points throughout the day today. Do you see any limitations in anyone coming from a specific background of being exposed to this technology and getting educated about CRISPR and its potential? Do you think that we have as a society to overcome any barriers or kind of formulate some better platforms to get equality and across the board to really get CRISPR to where the next level is?
I do. I think representation is very, very important. The more you see people like yourself doing these careers, the more you think that, oh, I can achieve that, or I can do this. And when you see someone explaining these therapies, this technology, then it's more understandable, or it's more relatable. And so I think getting to talking to younger students, getting them more interested in science, fueling that spark, because sometimes that's all it really takes. If there's people who just naturally, they think analytically, or maybe they just have a natural interest in science, but they don't, see a lot of scientists or even doctors that look like they look, so they don't know that certain things are achievable. And it really can be something that simple. So just increasing representation and being mentors and going out into these communities and speaking to younger children and getting them interested in these career fields is really, really important. So I think in communities of color, especially Black communities, there's a lot of distrust between distrust in the science world. We can just go back to the Tuskegee experiments, and there's that bridge that has to be overcome. And the best way to do it is to go into the communities and communicate and educate, and have them understand like, oh, what is this vaccine? What is this therapy? What is, this new form of treatment, and how exactly it's supposed to work. But, have somebody that looks like them, have me go in these communities and explain what this new therapy is. And it's perceived differently. It's perceived, it's just more trusting to understand coming from someone that and someone that you can identify with, because as much as we don't realize it, but representation really does mean a lot, and you don't notice it until like you're the only person sitting in the room that looks like you.
So I was gonna ask that, have you ever come across with anyone of like any other gene editing scientist besides Zombie, that's in our lab, of color, or that's at a different position than you within the field? I haven't met another gene therapy scientist that's Black.
No.
So have you, Zombie, at any point?
No, I don't actually know a lot of Black scientists. I mean, outside of course, me and Indigo went to HBCU, so the majority of people in our science classes who went on to, work in laboratories or work in industry or went to medical school, they were African American. But outside of that, I didn't really see a lot of Black scientists or Black people in the medical field growing up. I was lucky enough to have both my pediatrician and my gynecologist be African American, but that's not common for a lot of African American people to also have representation in the medical field or in the research setting that they know personally. So like Indigo said, representation does matter. But we also have to be accountable for what we did as scientists and as in the medical field. A lot of times we say the African American community doesn't trust us, but we don't say we broke their trust, so now we have to rebuild that.
And trust is the base of everything in life.
Yeah, there's plenty of things that we have done wrong and continue to get wrong with minority communities. I mean, not just African American, but Hispanic and Indian and Native American. So across the board, there's things that we have done on our end that have been misleading or not trustworthy. So then you can't expect people to overlook that. We have to address that and then build trust from there.
So do you think that trust can be regained by having more people working in the field so people can identify like, oh, there's a girl that looks, there's a scientist that looks like me, or a family, right? If you go to the doctor, like you said, that you felt comfortable because you saw people that look like you. Do you think that's the limitation of the field then? It's not just the lack of education in the technology, but also the lack of representation of so people can assimilate themselves?
I think it's two parts. I mean, you tend to feel comfortable more with people that look like you. My parents didn't just happen to come across these Black physicians, they sought them out. They just felt more comfortable with that. My parents aren't from here, so all of their physicians are either African American or they're foreigners. So they'll go to Indian doctors or African doctors just because they feel like they relate more to the way they grow up and the diseases that impact them, that they just have a little bit more background on that, so they feel more comfortable that way. But also, if you don't necessarily belong to a minority group, you also have to be conscious and pay attention to what your patients are saying. Because I know for at least a lot of African Americans, they fear going to doctors that aren't from their background because they don't feel like they're listening to them.
And the Hispanics feel the same way.
Yeah.
If your doctor does not like greet you with an hola and a hug and a kiss, then you're like, I'm not going to that doctor, right? I'm like, no, I can't communicate with them. Yeah, and I think in the Hispanic community, sometimes they get misrepresented because they're like, oh, well, they won't be able to afford it because they're associated with a certain level of social economic position in society. So it's like, even if we try, they would never come because they can't afford it. Even the information that's getting to them is wrong. And I feel that's also part because some people based from in the Hispanic community don't take the time to really look at through and say, hey, but maybe it's because they're afraid of going to a higher level person, to a manager or whoever's in the office saying, hey, you know, that's not the right terminology. But if you have a lack of scientists, right, that understand Spanish and know how to really translate what CRISPR and gene editing is to Spanish, then less alone they will understand what the technology is. So even if with me, right, I can try, because when I talk to my parents, I don't talk to them in English. That's just the reality. In my household, we do not speak English. It's always Spanish. So when I try to translate in Spanish what I'm doing in the lab, I even sometimes come across as like, wait, is there even a word for that? There were different struggles at different time points that I had to overcome, making myself feel more secure of like, was I ready to go into a master's? Did I have the right knowledge? And even though the language might have been a barrier, the level of education at a certain degree might have been a barrier, I overcame them all, and that's where I am today.
I think for women, we definitely are still, men are considered scientists. Females aren't necessarily considered scientists yet. And I feel like a lot of the time too, male professors, at times, they see you more not as a peer or not as a student, but more as someone that they can use for their means. Honestly, the best way to overcome it is show that you can do more than your male colleagues, and show that you can work with everyone no matter what, and show that women do have a lot of strengths.
So all through high school, I was like, I'm gonna I'm going to move somewhere. I applied the entire East Coast, visited schools from Maine down to Florida, and I actually ended up in Delaware because my aunt lives here, and I had to pay for college on my own. Money was definitely an issue, but my aunt living here, I was able to save money that way, but I also decided to pursue my associate's degree at Delaware Tech.
So I think the biggest barrier that I faced was not knowing if I should be in the room, just period. Not knowing if I was smart enough or if I had enough experience, and just comparing myself too much to other people who were sitting next to me. And I just had to remind myself that, yeah, the person next to me might have done all these other different things that I didn't get the chance to do, and they might be younger than me sitting in the same spot, but I worked hard to get here and I deserve everything that I've worked so hard to get. This is where I should be, and this is the moment that I should be in at this time. And just accepting that your experiences and your struggle is what makes you unique. That perspective is what's needed in medicine. You bring so much more to the table just being in the room.
So Kristen, like, how do you, from the community college level and your intake in high schools, like, how do you see what is the range of students? How have students from different backgrounds, like, what is their response when you present stuff like that?
I think growing up in a small town, I will be honest, there was not much diversity at all. That really kind of came about more when I moved to Delaware and did community college, where I know a stat that Del Tech loves to tout is that their diversity in the college is representative of the state, which I think is actually pretty cool. Most of the experience I've had is that if you take the time to include everyone, it's appreciated. It doesn't really matter who you are, what you look like, as long as you're not feeling or you're not intentionally trying to leave someone out, that's always better. So the more that you can encompass different things, different varieties of topics, different issues, I think it's a better recepted. And I think that's what this education piece is. It's not just reaching specific special high schools, it's reaching high schools and students everywhere across the board, regardless of what they look like.
I'm kind of curious, like Indigo, Sambi, and Natalia, I know, because you had mentioned there's not a lot of Spanish-speaking scientists and stuff, and you guys both kind of gave examples of who you saw or who you identified with that kind of led you in that direction, but from elementary or middle school, like, what is that turning point in your life that if you could go back and kind of talk to the same people, talk to yourselves as kids, what would be a good point in which you could kind of promote more women of minority going into this field and really increasing having that diversity in the field?
For me, I would have to say the turning point, because as a kid, I was always interested in the science of life, how things are the way that they are. I would pick things apart and just try and figure out, like, okay, how is
put it back together, right? It's easy taking everything apart and never putting it
exactly.
back together.
But then you find so much out. I'm like, oh my gosh, how is this a flower? It's so intricate. And I've always had just that level of wanting to have understanding as a kid. And then the more I grew, I was pushed. My mom knew that I was interested in science, so she tried to get me to stay in the science track and give me more difficult subjects. But as you get older, you kind of stray away from things that you like so much when you were a kid. So I think the point that I would want at this age, want to go back and talk to myself, would be high school, because the track that I've found myself on, the more I talk to other people who are in medical school, it really starts at high school. The courses that you start to take, the mentors that you start to build, the experiences, and that's where a lot of students got a head start above where I was at when I was in high school, because I was just, at that time, just applying to different schools and trying to get into college, but there were students who were they were volunteering at hospitals, volunteering at like soup kitchens and stuff, and having these experiences that I didn't even have, and taking these very like AP courses. And I took AP courses, but just taking these really difficult courses that help them in college. So I would go back and talk to myself in high school and just, tell myself to be more on top of things, because I honestly feel like that's really where it starts.
Yeah, I would go back to high school as well. And I think I would just tell myself to be brave and more assertive, and like things that people don't naturally tell women to be. Because a lot of times women, like, especially in science courses, you'll see that the women are like sitting in the back or they're being quiet. And a lot of times they know what's going on, they know the answer, but it's always in our head not to be like the angry woman or like over like assertive and overexcited, and things that men get complimented for. And I think sometimes we're in our head too much about that. Yes, the world is telling us not to be those things, but those things are going to be important for your future. It's going to be important if you want to move ahead in whatever career you decide. So I think I would just tell myself to probably be a little bit more brave.
And it's interesting you say that too, because I know even undergrad and grad school, there's not a lot of female professors. So going back to not really seeing people that are like you, having a man teaching physics or having a man teaching biology, I feel like you're really getting the idea that women aren't necessarily strong in that field, even though once you get out into the workforce, once you get out into industry and stuff, there are very successful female scientists. I don't know.
They're normally like giving the more like basic roles, like just the single class professor or the technician role, like the more 9-to-5 job or TA, where you have all these other bigger male having higher rank positions. And I mean, it's something that I did catch on early on when I was in college, where in my department, most of the higher roles were all given to male professors and not female professors. So all the female professors were teaching like the basic introductory courses, and that for me was a little bit like weird. I was like, why can't a professor teach like advanced genetics or biochemistry? I mean, there were, but there wasn't as much as I would have imagined that there was in the field. Maybe that was just my take and my perception.
And even like the deans of the colleges, a lot of them are male until you get into like the humanities, and then it's female deans. And I feel like that doesn't represent what most women are. And
I think it's how aggressive the science field is. It's one of those things where like you finish your grad school and it's like the ticking time, you have to get to tenure. And for us women, sometimes the reality of life is a little bit different for men, because we're looking at, well, we want to have a personal life, and we're thinking about having a family, and that means family leave. And some environments in certain universities like take it in a good way, where you have enough room to take care of, go home to your kids, and then keep teaching. But there's other environments where your coworkers are so aggressive, and you know that if you don't get that tenure in the next 3 months, you're done. So I think
and then
that
you have to choose
help.
between career or family, and then it throws you out of the norm, the cultural norm of what a female is.
So they just settle for lower roles, saying, well, I'm not going to try to get tenure, or I'm not going to try to become the department director if I know they're going to make it very hard for me because I have other things that I want to balance out in life. That's my perception of what I had experienced. I don't know if your departments and your schools were similar situations, but
I feel like it's kind of like, it's a generational gap too, and I think we're starting to kind of pave that gap. But the issue is, I know when I wanted to go to medical school, I shadowed a surgeon, and he looked at me and he said, well, my daughter's going to be an anesthesiologist because she can work 9 to 5 and get the kids off the bus. Wow. And I remember, and it stuck with me so much, because I wouldn't have an issue working shift work. I don't see why that would be an issue for anyone. It doesn't matter who you are, what background you have. It's not just the female's role to get the kids off the bus, but I think because of the generation that he came from, it was still back in that the women take care of the home and the men are the breadwinners era. And I think that we're really starting to change that, especially a lot of things that are happening in the culture now and the new generation.
And science is not a 9 to 5 job. Science is the least 9 to 5 job. So like Kevin, right? Yeah, I know. I've seen you multiple times staying in the lab past 9 to 5, and we've all done that at one point or another. Like, how do you feel hearing our perspective of how we see ourselves as women in the field? Like, from your point of view, do you acknowledge that that is something that happens, or do you feel like you're like the way you were presented into science was maybe a little bit more protected because you were a male and driven by maybe male mentors or whatnot?
It's definitely something that I know that there are definitely times in my past where I've been given opportunities that I would not have been given if I didn't look like the person who was giving them to me. And there's a lot of backlash that people who do look like me tend to do when this type of conversation is brought up, because they want to say like, well, I got here on my own merits, and I got here because I'm a good scientist and I know. And that can be true. But when it comes to a system that has evolved the way that it has, where the scientific field is mostly run by white men,
and it's okay to say.
Yeah.
You know, we have to be honest. It's like, this is an honest conversation. It's okay to say.
Yeah, it's something where it's not just that the onus for getting better needs to be on the people who are being disadvantaged by it. The onus for making the field a better place also needs to be our responsibility. There are definite implicit biases that are present.
I would definitely agree with you, and you really hit on a good topic, because that's the other part of wanting that diversity and being inclusive, whether it's people of different races or gender. You have to not only recognize that bias is there, but also you have to understand that you need to put work into changing that bias, have those conversations, the person like you were talking about, the surgeon, that needed to be addressed, and have people speak up and say something about this, and have those wheels moved, have things changed.
When I started working in gene editing, it was a really breakthrough time. It was right in a very critical transition point in gene editing, where the original platforms that had been developed were actually starting to fade out because the whole revolution of CRISPR was just starting. And right now, if you mention the word gene editing, the first thing most people associate is CRISPR. As we were trying to learn the technology and learn the science, there was no textbook. There wasn't any online Google form that we could type up and search. It all had to be what us as scientists knew from our basic education. And that is what's really satisfying, that everything we do is something new and we're setting the foundation for the field. And that's really what drives me to keep going back every day into the lab.
What most excites me about the field is how much work is and how much thought is going into the delivery of these therapies. It's not easy to target a specific cell or a specific cancer. It's not easy, but that problem's been recognized. Just understanding and knowing how much effort goes into just coming up with proof of concept experiments, coming up with the best way to deliver the therapy to that target cell gives me so much comfort in hopefully in the future and just even explaining these new therapies to patients and also administering them.
I enjoy the fact that we work on so many different things, and we end up, in working on those different things, touching a small point of research across the board. So some people are working on sickle cell, and we have an ongoing lung cancer project. So it's just cool to know that every cell line we develop goes into research that touches every aspect of potentially finding a cure for cancer.
My main goal for doing research and being in science is to help people and to just get a better understanding of different diseases and the mechanism behind how certain genes in our bodies work. So long term, I do want to get back into being focused on a certain topic and having a goal to achieve.
I started doing work on RNA with bats with white nose syndrome. I had an instructor, she pulled me aside one day and goes, one of my friends and colleagues has a educational kit that they want to beta test, and they want a student to do this. And she goes, and I think you are the perfect student. And that kind of wrote the rest is history for the Gene Editing Institute. So I started working with them, doing this education kit on gene editing, and we realized that this project I was doing had a really cool proof of principle that we could teach other institutes and students and teachers of everyone of how to do gene editing in their laboratories, because at this time, gene editing in like trade schools especially, maybe it was in the universities a little more, but it wasn't a very taught subject.
As of recently, a large portion of my laboratory time has been focused on the development, testing, and publication of a software program that we call Decoder. Decoder is a bioinformatics tool that takes the DNA sequencing data from real gene editing experiments and looks at it at a scale and at a level of precision that wasn't really possible before with the tools available.
So we talked about diversity and gender in the setting, but let's kind of think about it again in CRISPR. So here we have a really new breakthrough technology. It has a ton of potential. Is this, I mean, I reach out to students and I talk to them and I explain it to them because it's not being taught yet and it needs to, but is this technology something that we can use to reach the communities who haven't been kept up to date or are being taught things that maybe were very relevant multiple years ago but now have no field? Is this something that we can use as a tool to help reach those communities that, like we talked about trust, that don't trust us? Is this something we can do to kind of transform that discussion?
I think so. I really do. Because if I can just, and I know this story might be true for a lot of people my age, but you know, my parents, my mom, she went to college, my father did not. And then my grandmother and grandfather, they, I don't know what they did, but they didn't go to college. So the way that their view of science is changing, I think, with each generation. Like my grandparents definitely would, if you introduced something like this, would never, you know, they wouldn't accept that something like this was possible or that it exists, and would never let it touch their body. And my parents, they'd be a little bit more accepting of it, but the fact that I'm there to explain it to them, you know, a lot of the kids in the generation, like for me, like we have parents who didn't necessarily go to college, and then you can come back and you can explain these things to them so that they're more perceptive to it. And then you have like me, I fully have every intention of going back into communities and explaining things and to those who might not have like their grandkids or their sons or their daughters who can explain those things to them and communicate that information in a way that they understand it from someone that they might trust a little bit more.
Knowledge is power, so you have the power to go and do something about it and do it while we're discovering it, while we're going through the clinical trials. And I think one big thing and potential of this technology, and especially for the African American community, is that one of the really critical clinical trials that's ongoing with CRISPR is for sickle cell anemia. And that is great because it's not something that we waited till after we knew if CRISPR worked or not. Not that we're saying that it's not going to work, but after we tested on other things and on other maybe social, racial backgrounds. No, we decided to put it in the front and go after a disease that has been put aside for different reasons, and there's no real cure, just treatment. And it's real, it's in our community. People live with it and people don't talk about it. And now it's the breakthrough technology that will move science at a whole different level, especially the biology field, is what's being applied to them. And I think that's the great platform. That's the big step everyone was waiting, and we have it now. So I think we can close the gap now there's other things that need to happen in between. We need to get more people involved and interested, but we will get
I
there.
think the thing is like Indigo's been saying, and like all of us have been saying, Zombie, it's that person that you can approach, that person that looks like you or is like you. And when you're able to take a community member or someone that you feel is within your community or with similar to you, using that as the front and then presenting stuff, I think it is possible. If we're open on our side, I think that our openness and our ability to want to connect that divide, I think is a great first step in going out into the community and presenting things, because there's a lot of diseases that I feel like aren't talked about. It's not just sickle cell anemia, but even going into like HIV and stuff, people don't want to talk about certain diseases, certain very prevalent diseases, and I feel like if we can get into the community and start presenting that, start talking about CRISPR, start talking about treatments, start asking the community what treatments they would like to see, I think it would make a big step.
And for you, Sami, your parents aren't born U.S. born, right? They immigrated, so maybe for them to talk about sickle cell anemia could be even a little bit more relevant based on your racial background. Did you ever think that your work would be so impactful in your community, or to the point where we're talking about like a potential cure?
I mean, you always hope that the work that you're doing is going to help people, and it's even better when it's people that look like you or like you can relate to, you know. So yeah, it's always a hope. Happened a lot sooner than I thought, but you definitely, I guess for most of us, our passion and part of what drives us to do our work is that we're helping people. So if you can take it even further to help people that sometimes or multiple times have been overlooked in general, that's always priority and something that you really strive to do.
So do you guys have any worry, right, about maybe CRISPR getting through the clinical trial? Great, we got through the clinical trial. It's showing great promise. Now, when we get to the next level as an actual treatment that doctors can prescribe, do you think there's going to be a limitation there going into the community? Is the conversation about, is this something that we were going to afford, or do you think we're even ready for that? Do you think people are going to be open to a doctor telling them, hey, we're ready for CRISPR and sickle cell on a sickle cell anemia patient?
I definitely think that there will be some pushback, because it is a rather young, rather new technology.
And daunting.
Yeah.
You're changing somebody's DNA. Even if it's not, like, even if it isn't germline and you're passing it on, you're making a change to a person.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard to accept that. It's hard to want that in your body, especially imagine if you don't know the science behind it, you know, and the main thing is education. And it just takes time. You know, it takes time in order for people to understand that this is something that we want to improve, like with sickle cell anemia. It's an orphan disease, it is. Mm-hmm. But it largely affects African Americans. It largely affects Black populations, and you don't realize that they have it usually until they have a sickle cell crisis.
Is it 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that you see that maybe that gap and that trust will be regained? Do you think are we talking about something like really far down the line, or are we getting better at it where maybe in the next 5 years people
Definitely getting better. Definitely getting better, but there needs to be the data there. There needs to be things that can be presented to people to let them know that this is something that's safe, it's been tested this way. And like, as I said, with each generation, we're progressing. There's more and more Black people going to college and understanding, you know, the information that they need to know in order to make the right decisions, whether treatment is right for them or not.
Yeah, so I think like we've really like just focused a lot on education, that there is the possibility of this breakthrough technology to close a gap, and that there are young scientists like us that are willing to be the driving force of closing that gap and really move and try to do our best to get that done. And not only the fact that we're scientists and that we work together on a day-to-day basis, but that we all have very unique, different backgrounds. And I think that is a very important aspect of it, because when we all come together, we're bringing different points of view, and we're really driving the message in different directions that we can cover the different locks of in a really more efficient way. And I think that's really great about what we're doing, and I couldn't be more happy of being surrounded in a field of so many great people.